For further analysis on our top story, we're now joined by Carlos Nobre. He is a senior researcher with the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Sao Paulo. Carlos, good to have you on the News Hour. You know, all this is entirely consistent with the predictions, and the sad part is that we've been hearing these warnings repeatedly. I mean, is this going to be the new normal?
Well, yes, in terms that we should be prepared to expect these heat waves, droughts, excessive rainfall in some places, disasters increasing tremendously, as we are already seeing. We cannot say absolutely that every summer in Europe or North America or China would have exactly this record that we are seeing this July. But this is very close to become, let's say, the new abnormal. This is really what we should be very prepared. And we could see last year, 61,000 people got killed due to the heat wave in Europe. And we have to be very prepared for these things to take place very frequently.
The majority view within the scientific community is that all this is it's caused by humans. It's human-induced. As a scientist, how frustrated are you that big businesses continue to profit on fossil fuels, that governments display climate inaction? This is extremely frustrating for a person who's dedicated all their life to preventing this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, last year was the record in terms of emissions of fossil fuel, of gases, all gases, including particularly 70% is due to the fossil fuel. And we don't see a reduction. The Paris Agreement targets would require 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. We are not seeing at all the world going that direction. Still, as you said, fossil fuel is a big industry, the largest industry in the world, and they continue increasing emissions. 2023, first 6 months, emissions continue to increase. So we have to completely disruptively stop emissions. We have to reduce rapidly fossil fuel in the world.
2030 is an important year. I would like to bring up with you perhaps a silver lining, because we are witnessing a dramatic reversal in policy, especially in your country. President Lula has plans to completely eliminate deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, at least in Brazil, by the year 2030. How much of an effect is this, do you believe, is going to have on rising or halting or reducing the rate of temperature increase?
Well, all deforestation on the planet represents something like up to 12 to 15% of global emissions. But of course, this is very important. To reduce emissions to net zero by 2050, we have to, instead of deforesting the tropical forests, particularly in Brazil, in the Amazon, we have to not only to get to zero deforestation, forest degradation, but also to have these huge millions and millions of square kilometers in the global tropical areas to become forest restoration. We have to make the forest to restore, because tropical forests restoring, they absorb, they remove a large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that should be the policy. That's the policy of the current government in Brazil. President Lula has said that, for instance, restoring 30 million hectares of highly degraded pastures in Brazil, and also getting to zero deforestation, forest degradation before 2030. First 6 months of this year, deforestation reduced 1/3 compared to 2022 in the Brazilian Amazon. So those are good news.
Carlos, if I could just ask for you to hold on 1 second. Let's turn our cameras to Washington, where U.S. President Joe Biden is speaking on the topic. Let's listen in for a moment.
People get through this tough time. And we're also going to talk about steps we're taking to help communities prepare, plan, and recover, and make our nation more resilient in future heat waves. And there will be more. I don't think anybody can deny the impact of climate change anymore. There used to be a lot of time when I first got here, a lot of people said, oh, it's not a problem. Well, I don't know anybody, I shouldn't say that. I don't know anybody who honestly believes climate change is not a serious problem. Just take a look at the historic floods in Vermont and California earlier this year. Droughts and hurricanes that are growing more frequent and intense. Wildfires spreading a smoky haze for thousands of miles, worsening air quality. The record temperatures, and I mean record, are now affecting more than 100 million Americans. Puerto Rico reached a 125-degree heat index last month. San Antonio hit an all-time heat index high of 117 last month. Phoenix has been over 110 degrees for 27 straight days. And with El Nino and the short-term warming of the ocean, that exacerbates the effects of climate change, making forecasts even hotter in the coming months. Ocean temperatures near Miami are like stepping in a hot tub. They just topped 100 degrees, 100 degrees, and they're hitting record highs around the world. And that's more like, as I said, jumping in a hot tub than jumping in an ocean to ride a wave. Most people don't realize for years heat has been, I have to admit, I didn't know it either. I thought it, I knew it was tough, but the number one weather-related killer is heat. The number one weather-related killer is heat. 600 people die annually from its effects, more than from floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes in America combined. And even those places that are used to extreme heat have never seen it as hot as it is now for as long as it's been. Even those who deny that we're in the midst of a climate crisis can't deny the impact of extreme heat is having on Americans. Americans, like an elderly woman in Phoenix, who fell out of her wheelchair and after 5 minutes on the ground had third-degree burns. Third-degree burns. Or the firefighter who's already has lug over 45 pounds of gear through smoke and flame, which is incredibly hot. The job is even harder and more dangerous to do in record heat. For the farm workers who have to harvest crops in the dead of night to avoid the high temperatures, or farmers who risk losing everything they planted for the year, or the construction workers who literally risk their lives working all day in blazing heat, and in some places don't even have the right to take a water break. That's outrageous. That is outrageous. Anybody who says that, does that. Folks, we really want to pretend these things are normal? Experts say extreme heat is already costing America $100 billion a year and hits our most vulnerable the hardest, seniors, people experiencing homelessness who have nowhere to turn, disadvantaged communities that are the least able to recover from climate disasters, and is threatening farms, fisheries, forests that so many families depend on to make a living. But none of this is inevitable. From day one of my administration, we've taken unprecedented action to combat the climate crisis that's causing this. We're using a law I got passed the first day in office, first month in office, called the American Rescue Plan, to help states and cities promote energy efficiency, reduce flooding, and open cooling centers. We're delivering over $20 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law to upgrade the electric grid to withstand stronger storms and heat waves so we don't cause more fires. Look, last year I signed the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant climate investment ever anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, FEMA has been on the ground responding to those unprecedented weather emergencies in real time. And I've traveled an awful lot in that helicopter with you all across the country. And to see the devastation that occurs, the kind of wildfires and drought and the like. We've launched a place you can go, heat.gov. Go online, heat.gov, to share life-saving information that you may need to know about. Last year, my Department of Labor created the first ever national program to protect workers from heat stress. Since then, we've conducted 2,600 heat-related inspections at workplaces nationwide to protect the health and safety of the workers on the job, so they're being taken care of. Today, I'm announcing additional steps to help states and cities deal with the consequences of extreme heat. First, I've asked Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su to issue a heat hazard alert. It clarifies that workers have federal heat-related protections. We should be protecting workers from hazardous conditions, and we will. And those states where they do not, I'm going to be calling them out, where they refuse to protect these workers in this awful heat. Second, the Acting Secretary of Labor will work with her team to intensify enforcement, increasing inspections in high-risk industries like construction and agriculture. This work builds on the national standards the Labor Department is already developing for workforce and workplace heat safety rules. Meanwhile, the U.S. Forest Service will award more than $1 billion in grants to help cities and towns plant trees that in the long term will help repel the heat and expand access to green spaces so families have a place to go to cool off and to bring down the temperature in cities. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is providing billions to communities to make buildings more efficient and to make them more heat resistant, open cooling centers for residential areas and in the cities that the communities can go to be safe. The Department of Interior is using infrastructure funding to expand water storage.
U.S. President Joe Biden speaking in Washington, D.C. on the various climate disasters throughout the country and an action plan to combat this growing climate crisis. All right, let's go back to Carlos Nobre. Carlos, thanks for your patience. When I'm listening to President Biden, I'm thinking, as the leader of the world's #1 emitter of greenhouse gases, of carbon polluter, they have to take the lead on this, along with China, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Historically, U.S. is the largest emitter. China is the second one. Now China is the first one in the last 2 decades. Absolutely, absolutely. And these countries, China has more than 80% of emissions by fossil fuels, United States more than 70%. So they have to advance very rapidly for we move away from fossil fuel. We have plenty of solutions with renewable energy, solar, photovoltaic, and also wind energy. So all those things are possible, but we have to accelerate the implementation, globally speaking.
When you're talking about accelerating the global implementation, talk to us about how important incentives are to the transition, not only away from fossil fuels, but also towards renewable sources of energy.
Yes, the financial system in the world should really be financing very rapidly because, in most countries, even solar energy, for instance, is cheaper than coal fire or fossil fuel fire power plants. So but there has to be a very strong investment, financial system, but also the governments. And of course, the Green Climate Fund, which has not reached $100 billion as promised in 2009, 2010 at the COP15 in Copenhagen. It's still the developing countries, they deserve to get this Green Climate Fund also for all countries in the world, not only the US and China and European countries, but to move towards this transition. This is really very important. COP26 in Glasgow indicated that for this rapid transition towards renewable energy to net zero emissions, we have to spend something like $700 billion a year, but we are not even getting to $100 billion a year.
That is the key mark. All right, Carlos Nobre, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for joining us here on the NewsHour. I do appreciate it.